Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about how to do a character analysis chart for your comparison and contrast essay. So we're going to be looking at The Color of Love and going through this chart together. So on one side of the screen, you'll see where it says evidence and observations about the character. So we're looking for some sort of quotation from the text, from The Color of Love, that will tell us something about the first character. And the first character under analysis is the narrator, Senna, right? The writer of the piece, who's writing this first person essay. Then on the other side, we have your analysis of the observation. So we're going to analyze the quotation, and we're going to talk about what inferences we can make about the character based on what the quotation is telling us. So I've selected this quotation right here from the text, and obviously this is going to be a dropped quote. If this were an essay, I would have to integrate it. I'd have to introduce the quote, insert the quote, include my parenthetical citation plus my analysis, but this is just a chart to get us started, so I've just pulled in the quote by itself without introducing it. So here's the quote on page 15. This is Senna's point of view, believed that there was no such thing as nobility or class or lineage, only systems designed to keep some people up in the big house and others outside in the cold. So if I asked you to unpack that quotation, at first you might think, what is there to say about it? It's in pretty kind of plain, simple English. It might not seem like there's a lot to unpack, but actually there is. There's a lot of rich language here. Here are a couple points of analysis that I made. Obviously, your analysis might be a little bit different than mine, but here's what I put down. I wrote, Senna believes that class is an arbitrary institution used to unfairly divide people into groups or deny people their rights. And I'm basing that off of what the quote says, right? What Senna is saying about there's no such thing as these institutions or systems like class or lineage. In other parts of the essay, she calls it caste. Instead, these systems or these institutions, these categories are arbitrary and unfair. She also, it's pretty clear from the quotation, believes that these systems are oppressive, that they hurt people or keep people down. And then I want to unpack the term big house, right? At first that seems simplistic, right? Big house. But big house has lots of connotations. So one is obviously jail. We use big house as a euphemism for jail or for prison. But since Senna is also talking about race and the legacy of racism in the United States in particular, big house might also evoke a slave master's house or the slave owner's house in which some quote unquote house slaves used to work. So big house has a lot of different connotations there that Senna might be playing with. So you could do more analysis of this quotation, but for this activity, in this box, you would just put a couple of points of analysis. Note, your analysis does not even have to be a complete sentence. They can just be in note format, or you can use bullet points. Here's another quotation. I grew up in a home of urban chaos, a home filled with artists and political activists. Again, it might not seem like it's using a lot of figurative language, but there's still a lot to unpack. So my analysis is this. Her home was filled with flesh and blood people wanting to create change rather than portraits of ancestors. So if you look at page 15 and you look at the context, you can see that Senna is drawing that distinction. Her home, the house that she grew up in, was filled with real people. It was chaotic, and these people were activists and artists. Unlike her grandmother's home, which is filled with pictures of the grandmother's ancestors, right? Drawing a contrast between that kind of chaotic, lively, but exciting home filled with living people versus a much more kind of antique, antiquated home filled with portraits of people who have long since passed. Here's another quotation we can unpack. The old lady across the river in Cambridge seemed to me an endangered species. So obviously Senna is making fun of her grandmother a little bit and is using terminology that might seem kind of strange for someone describing their own grandmother. Let's unpack it a little bit more. Here's what I wrote. Senna views her grandmother as something outdated. Obviously, the word endangered species suggests something extinct or outdated or something that is soon to be extinct. Same thing with old lady. She feels distant and divided from her grandmother. So the reference to the river might be a reference just to, of course, the geography of Boston and where they lived on different sides of the river. But maybe she's trying to point out that contrast, like she feels this actual divide between the two parts of Boston. Cambridge, which is where Harvard is, much more kind of old school area of Boston versus where she lives. Maybe the reference to the river, that line or that border, is something that she's pulling out intentionally or highlighting intentionally. And then definitely endangered species suggests an animal that's about to go extinct, which implies that Senna thinks her grandmother is about to go extinct or is kind of outdated, and her views are old-fashioned, and that those views will perish soon. So it might not seem like a very polite way of describing one's grandmother, but here Senna isn't being particularly polite. She's talking about how she used to view her grandmother before they had this moment of connection. I've since decided that when you cease to express anger towards those who have hurt you, you're essentially giving up on them. So what do we learn about Senna from this quotation? Again, the whole purpose of this part of the chart is to analyze our first character, Senna, right, the narrator, through how she describes her grandmother or her own upbringing or her home growing up. So we learn that Senna gets frustrated with her grandmother, but she also wants to connect with her. Doesn't want to give up on her. We know that she's forgiving, but at the same time, she doesn't want to shy away from confrontation. She suggests that even when things are painful, when you have anger or hurt between family members, if you don't actually have those hard conversations or express that anger, it's kind of like you're giving up on them. So you could continue. You could find more quotes from the text about Senna and then put your analysis in the corresponding box. I'm just showing you 4 quotations and then some bullet points and very informal notes of analysis. Let's go to character number 2. So the second character is Senna's grandmother, right? For this essay, you're going to be comparing and contrasting whether it's these 2 characters or characters from another story. So you have to have the other character to contrast the first character with. So I have included quotations from the text, and your job for this activity is going to be to unpack the quotation. So you could write a complete sentence right here if you want, or you could just do bullet points or notes kind of like I did up on the previous slide. Let me give you a couple examples of some words you can pull out. So one quotation I have here, this is Senna describing her grandmother, right? So this whole thing is narrated through Senna. It's filtered through Senna, so it's obviously going to be subjective. But we do learn some things about her grandmother. So by calling her ancient, as white and dusty as chalk, that might seem kind of like a rude way of describing her grandmother, but it gives us a lot of info about the grandma. Here are some words you can unpack. The word ancient, and also the comparison to chalk, white, dusty, and chalk. Why compare her grandmother to chalk? What does that imply or suggest about the grandmother? Chalk is something that's kind of outdated, that we don't necessarily use as much anymore, that's brittle and easily breakable. What does that suggest about the grandmother? Same thing with these other quotations. This one, she spent her days seated in a velvet armchair, passing judgments on the world below. You might pull out words like velvet and judgments on the world below, unpack those, tell us what that reveals about Senna's grandmother. Her walls were covered with portraits of my ancestors, pale and dead men who had conquered Africa and built Boston long before my time. You might spend some time unpacking this term right here, conquered Africa. Obviously, Africa is a continent and not a country. Senna most likely is aware of that. So why is she using this way of describing an entire continent, right? Conquered Africa sounds very imprecise. Why is she using such vague, imprecise language there? Perhaps she's making fun of her grandmother, or maybe beyond making fun, maybe she's really critiquing this whole ideology that Africa is a continent that can even be conquered. Also, words like ancestors, portraits, pale, and dead, these are all words that you can unpack. One more. Among the portraits sat my grandmother, a bird who had flown in to remind us all that there had indeed been a time when lineage and caste meant something. To me, she was the missing link between the living and the dead. There's a lot to say there. The comparison of the grandmother to a bird, the reference to the word caste, which evokes the caste system, but in particular, pull out the word missing link, or the term missing link. You may remember studying this term in an evolutionary biology class. You can also just Google what missing link suggests and unpack what we learn about the grandmother from this quotation. So your job is to give some analysis of each of these 4 quotations, whether it's in a complete sentence or just bullet points, just note format. Analyze each of the 4 quotations that I have given you.